desire to. Fortunately, this is not such a universal coverage of Prince, but mainly from him. Henry Fuseli was born in Zurich, in Switzerland, and was a very precocious artist. He started at the age of 8½, and he continued a long and productive life of art until he died 85 years later. He had to leave Switzerland. He was exiled, in fact, because he and his friend, one of them being Lavater, who did the famous book on physiognomy, because they had revealed the depredations of a corrupt governor of one of the cantons. He then came, with the help of people he met, he came to England. This was an age in which the potential of young men and so forth was very much appreciated, and even before he came to England, he'd already been put in touch with people who could help him. And indeed, some of those people were his friends for the rest of his life, or their lives. So he's the thing about when I chose an illustration, a photo of an engraving of Fuseli, I chose one which showed him as a member of the establishment. He hadn't long been. It was shortly after he became a full member of the Academy. But the thing is, I'm worried about, because it's not the real him. He's more like the image in that. The image there is more appropriate for him. He was a passionate man. When we look at the Runciman here, we will see how that manifested itself. He was in Switzerland. He was not apolitical, as after all he thought about the downfall of Grebel, the governor. He had a remarkable education in which he studied Greek and Latin under the foremost authorities in Switzerland, and in particular a man named Boardmer, whose fascination was with the exploration of epics, of Germanic epics, and from the very beginning of his career, he was interested in epics. For example, very early in the 1760s, he had illustrated an epic on Noah, called the Noahide, with very interesting. His interest had always an epic extent, and in fact he hated little things and pygmy things. He always liked he needed a lot of room, and we will see that in some ways I have not done justice to his work, because a lot of the things I have here were illustrations made for books, and mainly small octavo books. And you will see that, I hope you will look elsewhere too, and the compression of his images, or the versions of some of his illustrations, does not compare often, although they are very effective, with larger versions, because the small illustration so big in an octavo is vertical. You have to keep the number of participants in the scene small, and you have to have a hook to grab the reader's attention. And of course, one that you will see I brought along one of the volumes of the 37, one of the volumes of the 9-volume edition of 37 of Shakespeare's 37 plays. So we've got a man who is very passionate, and we'll see this in fact when we look at some of the sources of to which Runciman recurred, and we will see that he knew Runciman in Rome. He went to Rome in 1770, and he remained there until 1779. And he learned a lot. In particular, he got to know, among the Danish contingent in Rome, he got to know a famous sculptor named Serge, who had a very acute awareness of the central nature of the human body, and he introduced Fuseli to various kinds of, one might almost say, mere orgies that Serge, who was well funded by a grant from the Swedish government, used to hold. If you would like to follow me round as we do this, if you line, and it is also part of, it also reflects Runciman's political convictions. I think that sometimes it's very interesting to look at the models which an artist like Fuseli or Runciman used, because this is clearly, Runciman was clearly caught up in this Scottish nationalistic movement of the period. This was the memories of Culloden, from 1715, and of the further massacre in Scotland in 1745 was still fresh in the minds of the Scots, even though many of them became very Anglified, if you can use that word. And this is, if we look at this particular thing, apart from its aesthetic effect, it is interesting to see that it represents the arrival of Queen Margaret, who later became Saint Margaret. She married Malcolm III, the king of the Scots, and she was later became a saint. And you will see it's a very beautiful thing here with and how the body, her dress and her gown is highlighted, and I can tell you, I made some photocopies here of the source of the image of St. Margaret. One of the because this group, very large international group of artists in Rome at this period, they had a whole museum around them, and so they were all very influenced by the art they saw, and Serge drew for us this is his rendering of the classical relief at Rome on which this figure is based, and Fuseli, this is Fuseli's imaginatively enhanced rendering of the same classical relief. And if you look at it, you will be, when I say that Fuseli was very passionate at times, he had a very large body of erotic art, and it's interesting to see how Fuseli's admiration of the classical female figure here has brought him to a very critical state of excitation. He just couldn't sort of help himself. This is part of his that Fuseli had. Now, amongst the kind of things which which we find which identify Fuseli's standing in the, he's now known, has been since 2006, when a great many things which are very titillating, as you can see at the drop of the blouse, or he's there to sort of record it, and not to mention more other kinds of things. There are very, very few of his erotic drawings in circulation. They've been bought up, but in about 8 years ago, I wrote up a version of a pretty raunchy, explicit scene, and wrote it up, and it's very difficult to know what to do with something like that. It was a great challenge, because you can't just say, wow, why and how. He married a woman, by the way, named Sophia Rawlings, who was everything that a man like him would want. She had a superb figure. She was very vain. He could use her as his model. She appeared in a great many of his engravings and paintings. I left out, for example, I left out today all the Milton things and all the various other things, including Oberon, which has these, which is a kind of juicy and very interesting story written by a German writer, and in 1805, the second edition of his book, which hadn't previously been illustrated, appeared with 12 illustrations after Fuseli, and you can notice the figure 12. He wants to do at least 12 illustrations in a work. For example, he would have long fights with the publisher Du Rovere, who published, for example, the whole of both the Iliad and the Odyssey, and Fuseli got very worked up because he was only given 12 subjects which he chose to work on, and we'll come to those in a moment, but for me they have a particular kind of interest which I'll discuss. But does things like lining up the witches as if they were on a coin, and you've got them each with their finger to their lips, you know, like say no evil, see no evil, and so forth. And it's very effective. Things of 14 feet by 13. He was what we call a history painter, but he liked a lot of space because he believed space gave sublimity. And I must say that on recently going through his commercial illustrations for works like this edition of 37 plays of Shakespeare, that in some ways, although he does a very good job, the narrow width and limitation really detracts somewhat from the larger things, although sometimes some people don't like his painting. Because of course what happens in any case is that in converting, in translating a painting to, in converting a painting to copper, it meant sort of compressing the action, and some of them appear not as splendiferous as they are in paintings he did. And indeed, that's also true about his engravings of Milton. I didn't bring my set of Milton published by Du Rouvray, Huguenot publisher, because some of the figures are huge. He's got Satan standing there like a hero, and in fact, for Fuseli and for the Romantics, Satan in Milton's epic was indeed a hero, and the hero of the thing, even though Milton himself took every chance he could to denigrate and downgrade the character of Satan and his accomplices and so forth. This is another example of a work that was engraved by Blake. That painting is actually very large, and in fact I'm not quite sure whether it was based on a newly discovered one of that theme, because there are two versions of it, and it was made a little museum in Lancashire, a part of Lancashire near Blackpool, quite internationally famous. I was part of the team which organised an exhibition in Parma of Fuseli and his paintings and so forth, and we had asked them to lend it to us, and they fell over themselves lending it to us, and after that people, institutions were clamouring for it. It just goes to show how even in art exhibitions there's not a little agenda present. I'd like to say a couple of things about...
Compare the others, which are basically copper plates. This is the advent of using steel for engraving. So
yeah.
The impressions are clean, very dark, and it allows for the what we would call the miniaturization of the subject matter. So in terms of publishing, where editions are small, these are really pocketbooks that they illustrated because of their very small format. So that was why I think David wanted to...
Yeah, Marilyn is now going to talk about some other items we have, most of them, two of them from... and some modern prints there, and I'll leave you to it.
Okay. Well, you've heard about one part of the collecting journey, which was based and centered on a single artist. So this is part of what this collection is that you're seeing. Now, the one reason that David was very apologetic that we no longer have some of these items, including the large format Boydell prints, is because they are now in the Zental Bibliothek in Zurich, along with several drawings we donated and manuscript letters and rare illustrated books. So that's one aspect of a collecting journey, which for David started in the early 70s. So in terms of what we've been doing together and collecting of prints, as I mentioned, I grew up in Chicago, and so I had the Art Institute of Chicago. It's important in terms of my collecting interests that one of the first illustrated books that I remember buying for myself as a teenager, and you know there are many calls on a teenager's allowance money, was the complete illustrated works of Shakespeare, but illustrated by Rockwell Kent. And I remember that it made such an impression upon me, and also a reproductive portfolio of Japanese prints for sale. It was just for the image, including Toshi Yoshida. So I started collecting prints actually in college. And so I was fortunate enough to go to the University of Iowa, which has a very strong printmaking tradition because of Mauricio Lazansky and his workshops, his study, and many of his students who went on to teach throughout the country. And so what I brought along is one of our larger prints that we still have, and this is by Abigail Richards. This is an artist proof called Possum. She was a fellow classmate, and this work in further state was submitted as one of her diploma pieces. One of my classmates at the same time I was at Iowa is a familiar name to all of you, and that's Craig Subler. And through your generosity in the Print Society, purchased some of Craig's prints, which are now part of the museum's permanent collection. It is for that reason that I have always been very fond of Warrington Colescott for his satiric prints, which were on display here, which talked about the history of printmaking. And I must admit that one of my favorite pieces there is the Ensor Light, the arrival of Lazansky into Iowa City. And so it's interesting to me that there were a number in this series, but the one about Lazansky was not donated to this museum, whereas the donors to the museum elected to donate it to the Smithsonian. So that's the missing piece for the Warrington Colescott, Lazansky's arrival in Iowa City with a slouch hat, long coat, looking like a mobster, quite frankly. And I guess there are those who say that Lazansky's influence was maybe overweening, but I liked it. So anyway, so I brought the Abigail Richards